This is Bloomberg Daybreak Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Investors look ahead to a busy week of economic data, including the Fed's preferred gauge of U.S. inflation. China's yuan jumps after the PBOC signals support for the currency. Russia holds a day of mourning after the death toll from Friday's terrorist attack in Moscow reaches 137 people. The Kremlin continues to suggest Ukrainian involvement in the massacre claimed by Islamic State. Plus, U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris declines to rule out consequences for Israel if it invades Rafah. This as the UN Secretary General calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire during a visit to Egypt. It's just